All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the full stack workflow, right? And specifically when we talk about the full stack workflow, we're going to talk about how our front end is actually going to communicate to our back end framework now. Now, this is going to be a lot easier than expected, and it's thanks to the ability that we have from the Docker network. So let's go back to take a look at some of the drawings that we created yesterday. Because of the Docker network, our entire full stack application is living within the same host. All right. Um, if it wasn't for the Docker network, we would need things like CORS that would allow us to speak to outside parties. So if you want to open up your API so that it's public and other people can actually just interact with your API, make sure you take a look at Django CORS. And it's going to make things a lot easier for Axios to be able to communicate with us because it's essentially coming from the same exact source. All right. So we're all already inside of the Docker network. We have our Postgres container running. We have Django running. If I take a look here, here's my authentication page. I can come over and take a look at my API /v1/test. We can see connected is happening. I do have some migrations that I need to apply, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. This is kind of project setup. If I run Docker PS, I'll see my Django container. And let me actually close this a little bit. So let's go ahead and go into Docker exec-it Django container in Bash. We're going to make migrations here. And we're going to migrate. And this way, everything's inside of my database already. My database has all my information, and I can actually interact with my models. All right. Well, so far, we've learned how to build an API that connects to a database. So far, we've learned how to build a user interface that talks to a browser, but we haven't learned how all of these pieces can actually connect together, where a browser sends a request after serving static files, and our server returns a response. From there, our static files just constantly update, keeping the user interface updated throughout the entire interaction. All right. So that's what we'll be covering today. We're going to start off with authentication. And after authentication, we'll start talking about CRUD during part two of our lecture. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the material that we'll be covering today? Okay, fantastic. Let's go ahead and start this off then. I'm going to need a separate terminal to go into my client. So I'm going to cd into client. I'm going to install this project running npm install. You'll see that that will create some node modules. All right, great. From here, I can run npm run watcher. That's going to rebuild my disk directory every single time I run something or I update the files. Let's make sure that that's working. I'm going to come over to source and in app.jsx, I'm going to add an h1 tag stating hello Corsair. And then I'm going to save the file. So that should rebuild. When I refresh, I get hello Corsair. All right, so my file is constantly being updated. I just have to update and refresh my information. Well, let's take a look at this authentication form because this is what we're going to be interacting with. We're going to come over to the auth page. The auth page receives a set user from user outlet context, and it goes into the auth form. All right, here in the auth form, I have the following. I have email, password, a create and set create. Okay. I'm assuming this has to do with this portion. So if we're logging in or not logging in, nice. We have our handle submit button. So once this form is submitted, we're going to create a user dictionary. That user dictionary holds email and password. We're going to analyze whether we're sending a create or a login method. And then we're console logging the dictionary along with the method. We're setting the user and we are emptying out our form. And then finally, we're navigating back to home. All right, so a couple of actions that happen here. The form itself isn't too impressive. What I really care about is this handle submit method. All right. Well, in order for this to function correctly, to actually be able to sign in a user, what does my front end need to, who does my front end need to be talking to? All right, because when a user signs in, and I think about it from a Django perspective, I'm essentially going to generate a token. So where does this request need to be routed to?
To the Rust framework.
Yeah, it's going to eventually go to my REST framework, right? This is where my request, or when I submit this form, it should be sending a request over to Django, and Django should be processing said request and returning whether it was able to successfully create a token and a user. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and try to connect to Django. I'm gonna go ahead and create a use effect here. And within this use effect, I'm going to add an asynchronous function. Let's do const async, or excuse me, test API, which is an asynchronous function. And all it's going to be doing is it's going to utilize Axios. So let's go ahead and import Axios, which it looks like we don't have. Nice. So let's do npm, of course, install Axios. All right. So that brings in Axios. Let's import Axios. And let's test it out. Let's see here. So it did add the one package. I'm hoping this will work correctly, but we may run into some issues because of this dependency. Just letting you all know. All right, let's try to do let response be equal to await axios.get. And from there, we just have to specify that within this site or within this address, I want to go to API slash v1 slash test. Right? Just like we do here, I can go to slash API slash v1 slash test. And this is the response that I expect. I expect to get a connected equals true. Well, let's console.log response.data. Finally, we can go ahead and call test API. I'm going to open up the console. Let's make sure everything is running. Nice. Great. Awesome. We refresh, come over to the console, and there I have connected equals true. All right. Well, where's this connected equals true coming from? Where is this being generated? Or where could I find out where it's being generated?
Is it from one of the API routes that we've made?
Okay, let's check out, right? Maybe it's from one of our API routes that we created. Let's come over to the server. We can go into task project. We open up URLs. Well, here it is. All right, there's our path of API slash v1 slash test. And you can see that it's connected to the connection function, where we're returning a JSON response of connected true. And here we see connected true. All right, so my application is effectively now talking to my Django server. All right, any questions up to this point? It should all look pretty familiar, right? We're essentially just sending a request to a API. Let's go ahead and continue here. I'm going to come over to app.jsx. And now I'm going to actually track down this whole authentication function. I know my API is connected. I'm going to come over to my auth form. And here in my auth form, I want to create a function that will actually conduct my authentication. Now, usually once you start working with quite a bit of once you start working with a couple of different Axios requests and you're working with different APIs, you want to isolate this behavior. So in order to isolate this behavior inside a client, I will go into source. And here what I'll do is I'll make a utilities.jsx. Now, utilities.jsx, what is this? Okay, that's okay. Utilities.jsx is going to hold all of my Axios requests. And then I'll just go ahead and import them into wherever they are required. So for example, I can go ahead and import Axios from Axios. And once I have Axios, I can create an API instance. So I'll say const. We could call it Django server if we wanted to. We could call it API. In this case, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call it API. Now, this is going to be an instance of Axios. And I could give it a base URL, which is just going to help me not have to type things over and over again. All right, where I can do API/v1, and that will always send request over to the API. We can export this, and then we could test it to make sure that it works. Let's come over to app.jsx. Rather than utilizing Axios, I'm going to go ahead and import API from utilities. And I'm going to await API.get for test. All right, let's clear out the console. Let's refresh our application. I'm still getting this connected equals true. All right, all we did is we created a utilities file. In this utilities file, we went ahead and created an Axios instance that holds a base URL for API/v1. So all requests moving forward, whenever we make them, they're always going to have this API/v1 convention. In app.jsx, I'm utilizing a GET request that's going to test. Now, again, this is API/v1/test. And then we're testing the connection to make sure that our application works. All right. Any questions up to this point? All right, if you all don't have a question for me, then I have a question for you all. Why even make an Axios instance? How does this help me? Or how could it help me?
So you're not repeating yourself every time you make a request?
Nice, yeah. I'm not repeating myself every single time I make the request. If I'm working with a server that's living on an entirely different host, I would actually have to put the entire URL all the way over to API/v1. All right, so that does save me quite a bit of typing, and it ensures that I have consistency, right? Now, something else that I want everybody to annotate is that moving forward, if at any point my server goes down and I need to put it up in a different platform, it's being hosted at a different address, maybe we decide we want to change the domain name system that we're utilizing for wherever our API is living. Now I don't have to go through every single one of my code files and change every single time I utilize Axios, right? All I have to do is come to this one utilities file and change it in one place. All right, it's kind of leveraging OOP to the best of our ability here. All right. Well, now let's move forward with authentication. I can go ahead and export const, and let's do our create user, or we'll call it register user. Why not? This is going to be an asynchronous function, and it's going to return something. All right, for now, I'll just go ahead and say it returns none. Okay. Well, let's come over to our views. In my user app, I have a views.py that I can take a look at. And here's my create user function. In my create user function, let's see, we have login, user view. Okay, I think this is an error here for the create user because we wouldn't want token authentication nor is authenticated to be there. All right. So now here's my create user view. And what we're looking for a post request that holds data. We can see here it's grabbing an email. All right. And we can expect a response where we're either going to get told the arguments of errors and a bad response, or we're going to get a 201. All right, so that's important to annotate. So here we can have a response status of either 201 or 400, depending on the request. All right. Now, if I'm taking a look here, it says new user, app user, create user with start data. How can I find out what goes inside of that data component? What do I need in there?
Could you go to the model?
Nice. Yeah, I can come over to the model. The model holds an email and a username. So I know that all I need is email and password to be able to create this. So I can go over to my utilities and state that the body of request must hold email and password. All right. Well, what about the endpoint? How do I even access this view? And let me go ahead and pass that question off to Brandon.
Um, Sorry, I was not focusing. What was it again?
Yeah, we're trying to access this view of create user, but I need to define the URL where I could actually find this view.
The URL patterns?
All right, let's take a look at URL patterns. And I'm assuming we're talking about user app URLs. Okay.
Would you create a path there for it?
Well, there's these paths that are already created. We don't want to create one, but I want to identify what that path is.
It was create user, right? So the second one.
Nice. So we need to access create. And if we go to our project URLs, we have users. So what we're looking at here is going to be where the URL pattern is of users slash create. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we determined these three aspects of our request? Right? We figured out the URL pattern, figured out the response status codes that may be coming in, and also what needs to be held within the request. All right. If no one has any questions for me, then I have a question for you all. What is it that's going to be stored within response.data? Or how do I figure that out?
What's entered in the um, authentication page or the create user page. So like the email and stuff.
So we're talking about this?
Hmm.
Okay. So in here, how do I know what's going to be inside of that data component?
Would it be in the server?
Say that again, Jake.
Would it be stored in the server?
Yeah, so this is our server here, right? And our server is the one that's processing this request. It's going over to our view. And we need to figure out what this view is going to return as a
Uh,
response.
the response where it says like token email that bit, right?
Nice, awesome. So we can identify that data will have a token and an email. Nice. Or it will have a series of errors that are available. All right. Great. So now we broke down everything that we needed from our views. Now let's actually make our request. This request is going to take in data, which should be an object. I can establish my API. So we can say let response be equal to API.get, where we want to send a request to users slash create, where the data component should be included. But we need to make sure that data holds that email and password. All right. We can then work with the status of the response. So we can state, hey, if response.status. Oh, I forgot to throw in a wait. Why wouldn't I? Is equal to 201. Then I want to return response.data.email. Otherwise, I want to console.errors response.data. Because it's either going to come in. So here's where we're checking our response status codes. And we know that response data, it's either going to have the token, an email, or an error. And then we could return. So there's our registration function. We'll talk about the token separately here shortly. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how we built this register user? Awesome. Doesn't look like we have any questions. Let's go ahead and put it into action. I'm going to import this register user. And actually, let's just call it handle user auth. All right. So we're going to go into auth form. Here, I'm going to go ahead and import handle user auth. I'm going to turn this handle submit into an asynchronous function. Here, I already have my email and password. And now I'm going to go ahead and call my handle user auth, where we're going to await the handle user auth. And we're going to pass in the user dict as the data. I'm going to comment out the rest of this information here. All right. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. Nothing crazy should be happening. Let me go ahead and open up our Django, or excuse me, our Docker network. Here I'm going to do a@a.com, and I'm going to send it with a password of A. All right, so I get an error. So tell me, hey, there's been a request. It was caught. 405 HTTP method not allowed. Okay, let's see. In my utilities, I am in fact sending a GET request. Oh, that makes sense. Let's change that to a post. We can refresh our page. Do a@a.com, A. And now when we send the request, we're getting back a response. Looks like I'm getting a console.log, which is happening at my auth form. But it may be, let's do let response be equal to await. There you go. And now we can go ahead and console.log response. That might be a little bit more efficient. Let's try b@b.com and send B. All right. So there you go. We're getting our response with a new user being registered. All right. So a new user is being created. We're returning that data component, but currently there's no way for us to be able to handle the token of said user. All right, the token of the user isn't being saved. How could I handle the token of a user to make sure that it stays within the front end application? Does anyone have any ideas? All right, let me go ahead and pass off the question then. Oh, go ahead, Jake.
I was just gonna guess. I was gonna guess the database, but
Okay. Nice. Yeah. So our database already, that's separate from our front end application, right? Because our database is working within the server. It's a good guess. We are creating our token inside of the database, and that's a good place to retain it, right? But talking about specifically our front end application, how can we hold a token? All right. So I was hoping that somebody would say something regarding state. It's a little concerning that nobody was able to answer the question. So maybe we need to do some sort of review regarding the front end application. But typically, whenever we're trying to retain information in our front end app, we do it utilizing state. In this case, that wouldn't work because I want the token to persist every single time state goes away. So even though state gets erased, I would want that token to stay in my front end app. Well, this is where the clear difference between our front end code and our device start to take place. My front end code, which is my static files, is what handles state. And yes, it is rendered by the browser. But the browser itself holds something called local storage. And local storage can be accessed through my code to be able to store values and retrieve values every single time we visit the site. All right. But with that said, let's find local storage. I can come over to application. In application, you'll see there's a local storage section. So application, local storage. And then here's HTTP local. Currently, our local storage is empty. There's nothing there. This is where we want to place our token. Well, how do we do that? Right? If we start thinking about placing tokens inside of the browser, my immediate knee-jerk reaction would be, oh, okay, well, I'm assuming we're going to have to install an entire new package that will be able to interact with the browser and then be able to store tokens and retrieve tokens. Well, this behavior actually comes natural to JavaScript. Right? JavaScript is the language of the web, so it has the ability to access local storage. Let's do that. Right, currently in response.data, I have my token. So I can say let token be equal to response.data.token. Inside of my token, I can go ahead and say local storage dot set item. We'll call it my token and set it to the value of token. Now, when a user signs up, let's do oh, I forgot to refresh. There's a new token value that is stored. Now, this is an object, or it gets interpreted as an object. So you don't have to worry about the resetting this value or anything like that. As long as you set the item, this value will get updated. All right. All right. So now we're grabbing the token. The token is able to make the request. Fantastic. Well, we're able to set the token, but when we were working through all of our Django application, anytime we sent a request, where did the token have to be included in order for authentication to happen? We just took our Django assessment, so we should know the answer to this one.
In the request header?
Nice. In the request header. And then what header specifically was it that our token was to be stored? Let me pass that question off to Calvin.
Talking about like the login header? Or
Yeah, in this case, we're talking about the authorization header. Yeah, that's where the token needed to live, right? All right. Well, now that the token lives, or now that we're storing the token and we're receiving a token, we also need to add it to the authorization header for our API. We could do this by saying API.defaults.headers.common. Here, we're going to access the authorization header and set it to token and then the value of our token. So now when requests are made, our API will also be carrying the token. All right. Let's clean up our auth form now. Our auth form comes in with a user. So this set user function that's happening right here should be going to response. And everything else that's happening here can stay. I'm going to take off this console.log. But there's a different curveball that we have to handle there. Here we have a method, which is going to create an account or log in an account. Right? Method of create is either true or false. Well, we can leverage this handle user so that we can actually receive the same data. Because if we take a look at our views, our login function returns the same exact response of a token in email or maybe a 404. So a couple of things that we need to add to our comments. We may have a 201. We may have a 200. We may have 404. That also comes in. And the different URL patterns which are happening are of login or create. All right, so URL pattern or login. Both of them take the same exact data structure. So all we need to do is account for the change of either create or login and our status code. Well, the status code is easy, right? We can say or where response.status is equal to 200. That's an easy one, right? Both of these are successful request. We set the item. But now we need to write some logic for this create functionality. We already have this create variable. It's coming in true or false. So what we can do is we can pass in create. Can come over to utilities, ask for create. And I can make my URL pattern interpolated string. Where here, I'm going to go ahead and ask, hey, if create is true, then we're going to simply return create. Otherwise, I am going to return login. Now, my one function handles user authentication for both login and logout. Let's go ahead and refresh this application. Let's get rid of our tokens. Let's create a user. Let's do fr@fr.com. Do fr. We send our request. There's my token. I'm going to clear out my application. I'm going to refresh my app. Now I want to log in. All right, let's see what happens if I try to send a create request. Let's do fr@fr.com, fr. Well, this brings back an error saying, hey, something failed. I'm getting a 500 internal server error. Okay. Caught and promised with status 500. All right, so something in here failed. Let's take a look at what happened. All right, if I scroll up, self-DB, execution, hey, there's a duplicate key value that violates unique constraint. Well, this user already exists. That makes sense. All right, I expected this issue. Well, let's clear this out and send it to login. And now if I send it to login, we were able to log in an account. I can come over to the application and there's my token. We were able to log in and log out a user. And come over to auth form, bring back all of this code here. Let me actually come over to the console. We can remove this console or this method portion here. I'm going to come over to utilities. Okay, we're always returning email and token. Great. All right. I'm going to refresh my site. Going to go to fr@fr.com, fr, and attempt to log in. Okay. And there it is. My user is now logged in. I can come over to the application tab and my token is registered. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how we were able to log in our user?
Not on how, but like, how would you like handle that error that you got like for uh trying to log in or
Ah,
trying to create a user? Yeah.
yeah, so what we can do if we want to talk about API handling, we can come over to views. In views, we already have this try or accept. I definitely wanted to, when that request happened, I would have liked it to come in response.e arguments, but it's because of the way we're handling the exception, right? The exception that we received wasn't a normal database or it wasn't a normal exception. It was an integrity error, right? So in order to be able to receive this, we would have to account for integrity error. And then we would respond with integrity error, e dot messages or whatever's in there, right? It's all about how you catch the exception. Does that answer your question, Cam?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then Brandon, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah. Um, in CompTIA for Sec Plus, they like always just harp on the threat vectors or whatever buzzword it is. Um, and cross-site scripting was one of them that they like really talked about. And to me, when you said the local storage, is this the thing that you are kind of worried though, especially for something like user credentials, where it's like a possible cross-site storage or cross-site scripting attack?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to security, this is only for development purposes. The only reason why you would be utilizing local storage is inside of development. Otherwise, we would set it as a cookie, right? And there's a huge difference between those two because cookies are protected by the browser, whereas anything inside of local storage are not protected. We would set it inside of a cookie, and then from there, everything regarding how it gets set as a cookie and how it's retrieved from the headers, or excuse me, from the request itself, is on the server logic. So the server would be the one handling, hey, I'm giving you a cookie or I'm taking a cookie. And this is to make sure that there's no cross-site scripting happening, right? Now somebody that's writing JavaScript can't tell my server I need a token because my server is the one handling the logic for giving a token to the browser. Additionally, Django does come in with some pretty built-in security when it comes to cross-site scripting. Does that answer your question, Brandon?
No, definitely. And that's where, to me, I just always have trouble a little bit with the delineation of development versus production. And that, like, to me, it's I would always just try to aim for what would eventually be in production. But that's where, because I was talking to Tiffany about it yesterday with the debug equals true versus debug equals false and like the positives and negatives of each. And it just, to me, it's obviously hard to organize everything in your head where it's like, all right, here's the stuff I'm going to do for development. But when it goes to production, here's all the like checklist of things that I need to go back now and make sure that I address because they were only done for the development environment. So to me, I just kind of still have to focus on that and struggle with it.
Yeah, got you. No, and that definitely makes sense. Just for some more clarification, the biggest reason why we're utilizing local storage now instead of utilizing the cookies already is because you need a security certificate to be able to do this action. Without a security certificate, they can't speak to one another. The browser can't speak to the server and set a cookie. They have to be deployed with a security certificate, and that's to make sure for SSL, security encryption happening within the request. So this is more of a local development, and then once we have that security certificate and deployment, then we could apply the token, being a cookie.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? All right. If no one has any other questions, then let's start talking about what happens if a user is already logged in, right? Currently, my user is logged in, but if I refresh the site, my user is gone. I can't see it. I do have a token available that I should be able to utilize, but there's a couple of execution things that we have to think about. When my request is being sent to my server, my API must hold this token inside of the authorization header. Now, this function is taking place when a user either logs in or creates their user. But in the case that I just refresh my site, API only holds this information here. There is no way for it to know that this user already exists. So now I have to create a function that will be able to grab the token or ask, hey, does this token exist? If it does, I want to grab said token. And not only do I want to grab it and insert it into the headers, but I also want to confirm with the server that this is still a valid token. Saying, hey, is this valid? The server can say yes or no and return that response. Right? Where if it's not valid, we want to log out. And if it is valid, we just want to continue. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding this behavior? Perfect. If no one has any questions, then let's build our function that will create this behavior. Let's do export const. And what I have here is going to be confirm, or let's do a user confirmation. All right, this is going to be an asynchronous function. It's not going to take in any arguments. And the first thing that we need to grab is the token. We can say let token is equal to local storage dot get item, and the item we're looking for is of token. If I hover over this get item, it tells me, hey, this is what you're looking for. Nice. If there is a token available, this is either going to return a string or null. So if there is a token that is present, then I want to give it to API. So API.defaults.headers.common. It may be helpful to build a helper function that will do this for you rather than having to write it out over and over again. Just as a heads up to everybody, where we have token with token. All right. Well, that's the first part. All right, we make sure, hey, there is a token. If there's not a token, well, we just simply want to return null. And there is no user. So we'll return null. Because there is a token, we're going to give it to the API. And then we're going to confirm that this is a valid token with the server. So I'll go ahead and state, hey, I want let response to be equal to await API dot get. I can come over to my views. My views has an info view that for some reason is returning my token, but that's okay. We don't have to stress it. What I care about is the fact that it returns my email. All right, we can see that it's looking for token authentication. Great. So come back into utilities. Here, my view is going to visit users. at index. And then I'm going to, if, let's state, let user be equal to response.data.email. And then finally, we could return user. Now we have to make sure this is successful. So we can do something like if response.status is equal to, let's check out the views. There's no status code, so by default, it's going to be 200. So if it's equal to 200, this is the behavior that I want to take place. And if it's not equal to 200, then I want to return the user. All right, we could console.error response.data. All right. Again, we grab the token from local storage. We then give it to our API. After our API has the token from local storage, we send a response or a request to the server to make sure this is a valid token. If it is a valid token, we'll return the user's email. If it's not a valid token, we should return null. I put user in there, so there's a syntax error. And if there wasn't a token to begin with, we also should return null. All right. Now this function is supposed to confirm if there is a user. Where would I want to call this function? And this is going back to thinking about the React application, thinking about component mounting, when components actually mount. Where would this user confirmation live?
In the handle submit.
Okay, so we could put it in the handle submit, but the handle submit is a method that is only accessed through an action, right? This I want it to be conducted every single time a user renders the application. So because I want it to be conducted as soon as the user renders the application, I'm actually going to come over to app.jsx. Oh, go ahead, Jake.
I was gonna say router, but I don't know.
Nice. Yeah, so I'm going to come over to app.jsx. And here, within this use effect, instead of calling test API, I'm going to call user confirmation. And what I can do is I can set my user to user confirmation. All right, we could turn this into an async function. That will await. All right. So there's my user confirmation. Let's make sure that this works. I'm going to go ahead and refresh it. If I refresh it, I don't seem to get any errors, but also there's nothing happening. This request isn't actually rendering. So let's try to figure out what's going on here. First of all, let's make sure, oh, I should probably refresh it again. Yeah. First of all, let's make sure that this is working. So let's console.log. Confirming user and refresh it. Okay, so this confirming user isn't even rendering on my screen. All right, let me go ahead and comment that out. There it is. So there's confirming user. So there's definitely a syntax problem. So let's do const. Now, this isn't practical. You could turn this into an asynchronous function, but I don't recommend it. So instead, I just recommend building another function inside of it. Let's do is user, which is going to be an async function. This async function is just simply going to set the user to await user confirmation. And now we could just call the isUser function. And async. There you go. And there you go. Now my user is actually being authenticated. All right. I am confirming my user. My user is of fr@fr.com. It is grabbing my token and sending my request. I no longer need API, so I could just remove that there. All right. Now, this is doing the trick. It is actually rendering. Right? If I do a quick reload, and I want us all to pay attention specifically right here. When I refresh my application, you're going to see it kind of freak out a little bit, where welcome is actually here. And then after a split second, it moves back over to the side, right? So let me refresh. We can see that text kind of mutating. Well, that's an issue. Right? This doesn't really give a good user interface. And if I have a considerable amount of data that's going to be loaded in here and render over and over again, I really don't want this to happen with some sort of glitchy behavior. So there's got to be a better place where I can put this. Well, this is already at the app, right? This is the first element that ever mounts to the router. So I can't really get any more efficient than this, right? Well, Jake actually brought up a pretty good point to us. We could put this function within the router. So our utility still exists, and it looks exactly the same. Our user confirmation is setting a user. But now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to router. And in my router, I'm going to add a loader function. This loader function will be of user confirmation. Now, by adding this loader function in here, this is stating, hey, app will not render. I will not even attempt to render app until this user function has been resolved. So once this user confirmation function is resolved, then I'll render the application. Okay. Well, how does that tie in with app.jsx? Because as of now, I could refresh this all I want, but nothing is happening. If I go to utilities and I add a console.log, let's just do success, and I refresh it, the success message is happening, but my user is still null. Well, my router is triggering the function. Once the function is completed, it's then rendering my app, but my app is not aware of the result from this loader function. In app.jsx, instead of setting my user to null, I'm going to set my user to use. Oh, excuse me, I am messing this all up. There we go. To use loader data. And then I believe this is email. All right, so we're still getting somewhat of an issue here. We're console.logging the user, so the user is being set as undefined. The easiest way to fix this, let me go to utilities. Oh, utilities is already returning the email, so I don't have to do that. There you go. So here's my welcome, fr@fr.com, your task. There's no weird glitch anymore. It's actually rendering automatically. And the reason why it's not glitching anymore is because we're utilizing this loader function, right? It's stating, hey, before you render anything in the application, you must resolve this function. It's a much cleaner method for loading data than utilizing something like useEffect upon mounting an element. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how we're able to conduct the user confirmation?
Could you also add that loader function for any other element? If you wanted like access to like the base homepage, and then once they log in, they have different access.
Yes, you can. You can access the use loader function in all of the pages, and then you could also have multiple functions for those loaders as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions?
So you're using a combination of like use state and use effect to where like the token is stored in use state, and then when you refresh, it uses use effect to see whether or not there's a token.
Well, now there's no use effect,
Oh,
right?
okay, okay.
Yeah, now it's happening within the loader data, which is happening here in our browser.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Of course. All right. Now, the last portion of our lecture here is going to be being able to log out. Our user is now able to log in. They're able to create their account. But what about logging out? I am going to step on the gas here a little bit, so please tell me to slow down if anything becomes confusing. For being able to log out, I'm going to send a request. So I'm going to say sport or export const. Here we're going to do logout user, where we're going to conduct an asynchronous request. We don't need to add anything. We're just simply going to send a request. So let response is equal to await API.post users slash logout. Let's make sure that this takes us to the right view. We come over to our project URLs. Here's API slash v1 users. That takes us over to our user app URLs. And logout takes us to the logout view, where the logout view is simply going to grab the request user, delete the token, and return a success message. Nice. All right. I can close out everything that I don't need. Here's my logout view. So response is equal to await. We know this is going to return with a status code of 200. So we can say if response.status is equal to 200, then I want to, one, remove from local storage my item or my token. Then I want to delete the authorization header. So here we're going to go into API slash common slash, oh, not common, defaults. There you go. Slash headers slash common. What we're going to delete will be the authorization key. And then finally, we want to return null because our user will now be null. If this doesn't work, we want to alert to the user something went wrong. And either way, we still want the user to be able to at least see that the user interface changes for logout portion to them. All right. Now, this logout function, we see we have a button for logout. Let's take a look at this button here. I believe that's inside of my home page. Here's my user and user. Here's your task. Set user to null. Well, I want to do an asynchronous function that will set my user to the await of logout user. That will actually delete my token Let's make sure that that actually does happen. I'm going to come over to the application. There's my token. I'm going to refresh this. Everything's working great. And I'm going to click on logout. You can see that token is now removed. The set user is now null. And now my user is no longer present. Okay. Does anyone have any questions regarding being able to log in, register a user, grab a user's information, or log out? Awesome. Doesn't seem like we have any questions. Let's go ahead and finish off this lecture by talking about routing. Currently, a user is able to go to home or the authentication page freely, whether they're logged in or not. We don't want this behavior to be available to them. So instead, we're going to write a function that will allow us to control where the user is located. With that said, I'm going to bring in use navigate, and I'm going to bring in use location. We're going to create an instance of navigate, and we're going to create an instance of location. Now, use location simply just returns to us the location of the browser. Right? We could utilize just plain JavaScript, but because we're using React Router DOM, it's best to use in the built-in tools just to make sure we don't get any sort of unexpected behavior. Well, now it goes into the process of just simply creating a use effect. In this use effect, I'm going to check a user. So I'm going to say if there is a user and location I see. Let's do location.pathname is equal to, let's say, home. Or actually, let's do slash because they're not allowed to be at slash. I'm going to navigate them to home. Otherwise, if there's not a user and location.pathname is not equal to slash, then I'll navigate them to slash. And I would like this to happen anytime the user element changes or the location path name changes. Now, when I refresh this is going to automatically route me to the authentication page. Once I log in my user, if I try to go back to slash, you can see that it always takes me back to home because there is a user that's present. Once I log out, then I'll be routed back to the authentication page without having to implement any sort of extra navigation. So this use effect here is handling the routing for the user. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding routing? Perfect. In this lecture, we covered how to create an Axios instance. We covered how to handle user registration and user login with one function. We covered how to confirm that a user already exists. And we covered how to log out a user. Additionally, we talked about loader functions that are to be included within the router and leverage within their appropriate element. App.jsx utilizes this use loader data to generate the user. And finally, we talked about the navigation capabilities and how we could handle that with use effect. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that we covered in the first lecture? All right, let's go ahead and stop our recording here.